Despite the physical similarities, it's not every day you hear of twins turning out to have almost identical lives. It's even rare to see a pair dive so deep into the lives of gruesome crimes. In the case of the Spahalski brothers, we have a unique opportunity to trace the psychology of two cold-blooded killers related by blood and birth. In a chilling case of nature versus nurture, we can see what happens when something goes wrong in the genetic code. With 5 victims between them and a trail of prison sentences, the Spahalski twins are notorious for the terror they inspired and the lack of remorse for their crimes. What could be the reason for such unwarranted evil? Welcome to another episode of Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we will break down the case of Robert and Stephen Spahalski, who unleashed terror on New York citizens starting from the 70s to the 2000s. Let's dive right into the murky history of these disturbed individuals. Details about the childhood of the killer twins are scarce, but it is known that Robert and Stephen Spahalski grew up in Elmira, New York in the 1960s. Growing up, the twins were quite close, especially when they had to go through the divorce of their parents. This happened when they were 12 years old, after which they were raised by only their mother. The twins shared a bond many other children have never experienced. Sometimes it seemed as if they could communicate telepathically. They always seemed to intuitively know where the other one was and what they were doing. Robert and Stephen had a lot of common interests. They loved to attend parties, play games, and spend time together. By the time they were in their mid-teens, the slow and steady descent into a lifelong career of crime had already begun. The first to have an encounter with the law was Robert, who was arrested at the age of 16 and charged with driving a stolen car. Just a few weeks later, he was charged once again with felony arson after he started a fire in his high school. Robert was sentenced to 15 weekends in jail after he pled guilty to stealing the car earlier that year. And so the life of crime kicked off with a blazing start. On the 24th of November 1971, Mrs. Ida Ziegler found her 48-year-old son-in-law, Ronald Ripley, in the basement of the Salad Master Kitchen, which was the store that Ripley managed in Elmira Heights. Ronald had been stabbed to death, and the police investigation established that Ronald had been seen by witnesses in the store at around 11:30 p.m. the previous night. One of the witnesses came forward to testify that they had seen Ronald drive out at around 11:45 p.m. Later on, the car was found abandoned behind a grocery store near a bridge in West Elmira. This was when the police began to grow suspicious. Their focus turned to finding out whether Ronald had offered a hitchhiker a lift. But that theory didn't hold because the autopsy revealed that Ripley's attacker had snuck up on him from behind in the store. After this, the attacker slammed his head with a hammer before proceeding to stab the poor store manager to death. During the investigation, Stephen Spahalski was well known to the police, but they had not even considered him a suspect in the case. In the meantime, while this investigation was going on, Robert found himself in trouble with the law again for criminal trespassing. He was incarcerated for the crime and sent to the Chemung County Jail for a parole violation. While he cooled off, the murder investigation was still at its height. Once again, police brought Stephen in for questioning. It appeared that he would once again deny involvement, but something was different this time. To everyone's surprise, Stephen admitted to killing Ronald Ripley. He claimed that he had no choice because the store manager had made unwanted sexual advances toward him on that day. Following this, Stephen was arrested on the charge of murder and sent to the Chemung County Jail. Coincidentally, this was where his twin was serving time. It seemed the destinies of these two twins were more closely tied together than anyone would have originally thought. It would later turn out that the two of them spent most of their lifetime going in and out of prison. Sometimes they even served their time in the same facilities, even though they never committed any of their crimes together. Stephen was represented in his trial by public defendant Samuel Castellano. He pled guilty to manslaughter and thus avoiding an extended trial. Around the same time, Robert Spahalski was being released. Being true to his nature, he found himself in trouble with the law once again in July 1973. He was found guilty of theft, as he had stolen $3,000 worth of cash and equipment from a music store. For this crime, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but down the line, the judge was lenient on him. He only served 2 of the 5 years, but that was not the last the court would see of Robert Spahalski. In July 1976, Robert was charged with third-degree burglary after sneaking into a high school in Elmira. Once again, he received a prison sentence, but this time for 2 to 5 years. He was shipped off to a correctional facility in Auburn, where coincidentally, Robert's brother was serving his own prison sentence. 2 years passed without event, and in July of 1978, one of the twins tried to escape prison in a hidden compartment of a truck. Officials were not sure which of the twins it was, as at the time the two of them looked identical. The escapee managed to sneak into an army truck when the prison inmates were servicing it. However, the prison guards were tipped off, and the escape attempt was put to an end. Because they were unable to figure out which of the brothers tried to escape, the two of them were thrown into solitary confinement. They seemed to enjoy playing this little game with the prison guards, as neither of them was willing to confirm who was involved in the escape attempt. Robert was released from prison the following year. After his release, he started a job as a mechanic, but this did not last long. His impulses for criminal behavior soon boiled to the surface, and less than 2 years later, he was charged with stealing a coin collection worth about $15,000. Adjusted for inflation, that amount would be around $57,000 in today's money. The following month, he pled guilty to this crime and was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison. Upon release, he moved to Rochester, New York, presumably to start a new life. It was in Rochester that his dependence on crack cocaine skyrocketed. He loved the substance so much that he worked as a hustler and sex worker in order to finance his addiction. It was around this time in the 90s that he killed his first victim. He would not stop this newly found hobby until he was eventually put away for life. The first kill that investigators know for sure happened around that time. In Rochester, New York, sex worker Maureen Armstrong was found dead in her apartment by police on December 31st, 1990. She was wearing just one sock and electrical cords were wrapped around her neck, according to Benson. Robert apparently lingered at the scene and even spoke to authorities during the inquiry, presenting himself as the deceased woman's friend. After this incident, Robert's girlfriend, Adrienne Berger, was found dead in her residence in Rochester, New York, around 7 months later. According to court documents, he was later convicted of Berger's murder. The police took him in for questioning when they continued to investigate the gruesome murder. Berger's body was so decayed after festering in a heat wave for days that no cause of death could be confirmed. Flies flew around the windows and stink permeated the air. Investigators found out about Berger's relationship with Robert and questioned him. According to a reporter who covered the incident, they let him leave since they didn't have anything concrete to pin on him. That same year, Robert would murder his only male victim with a hammer, just as his brother had done to Ronald Ripley 20 years before. On the 2nd of October 1991, Robert Spahalski was stopped by the police whilst he was driving a 1980 Plymouth Valiant. When questioned by the officer, he told the police that he was the owner of the car. They asked for his name and he told them it was Charles Grande. The real Charles Grande was in fact a local landscape company owner, but the police did not know that. They sent him on his way only to discover 2 days later that the body of Charles Grande was decomposing in a bedroom at his home in Webster, New York. Robert had bludgeoned Charles Grande to death. According to the Monroe County Post, Robert was selling his body at the time, and a quarrel ensued between the men about payment. Police had suspected that Robert was responsible for the murder, but they still did not have enough evidence to charge him with the murder. However, he was charged with criminal impersonation, a charge which he was acquitted of in August 1992. This slippery offender seemed to be evading capture at every turn. Over the years, he continued to have clashes with the law, which led to further arrests and charges. Prison sentences followed for burglary and drug-related offenses. While all this happened, the day of his brother's release was fast approaching. Stephen was released from prison in 1999, but his freedom was short-lived as within a few months he was thrown back behind bars for violating the terms of his parole. He was not to make a reappearance until several years later. The twins remained relatively quiet for a few years until it all came crashing down for Robert Spahalski. In 2005, Robert, who was high on crack, began having images of his friend and next-door neighbor, Vivian Irizarry. He claimed he witnessed Vivian transform into a demon that he felt was necessary to kill. Robert strangled her and then washed and dumped her body in the basement. Robert would subsequently describe seeing the body and bursting into tears. He stated that he would often apologize to his deceased friend. In another bizarre twin twist, Stephen also admitted to talking to Ronald Ripley after stabbing him to death. Robert couldn't live with himself, and only a few days after murdering Vivian, he entered the Rochester police station and turned himself in. He also admitted to the other 3 killings. This was enough to give Robert the title of a serial killer. The jury took less than 2.5 hours to find Spahalski guilty of all charges, which included 4 counts of second-degree intentional murder and an additional count of criminal murder while committing a robbery. Spahalski, whose twin brother was imprisoned for murder in 1971, sipped water from a plastic cup and cast a fleeting glance at the jury foreman as the decision was read. When sentenced on December 12th, he faced a maximum of 25 years to life in prison on each offense. During the 2-week trial, the defense claimed that Spahalski had been a cocaine addict his entire adult life and was suffering severe emotional disturbance. Attorney Joseph D'Amelio admitted that Spahalski told investigators at the police station's front desk that he'd slain Vivian a few days before and left her body in the basement. He said, however, that Spahalski was high on crack cocaine during all of the murders and couldn't develop the intent to kill. During his argument, D'Amelio placed 2 bags of cocaine on the rail of the jury box and stated, "The demon is here," and it altered his mind. Spahalski was questioned for 12 hours without access to medications he takes 4 times a day for mental health issues, according to D'Amelio, who questioned whether the confession was voluntary. The prosecutor replied that the ferocity of the acts, as well as Spahalski's compulsive explanation of how he did them, demonstrated without doubt that he knew what he was doing. Police indicated that after confessing to 3 deaths, Spahalski was hesitant to confess to a 4th because he was set in his mind that doing so would have him branded a serial killer. However, after pleading with him to save her family from heartbreak, authorities said Spahalski eventually confessed to killing Maureen Armstrong, 24, on New Year's Eve in 1990. "I choked her out," he told police, when she demanded money for sex after he had split $100 worth of cocaine with her. Spahalski's statements matched witnesses' testimony and physical evidence in each homicide, authorities said, with some of it known only to detectives. Spahalski confessed to strangling his lover, Adrian Berger, then 35, in her apartment in July 1991, and killing Charles Grande, 40, 3 months later with a hammer. Spahalski claimed he had sex with Grande 3 times in exchange for drug money and murdered the landscape company owner in his bedroom when he was stiffed. He then swiped $1,000 from Grande's suburban home and escaped in the victim's car. Robert was found guilty in 2006 and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for each murder, which will be served consecutively. Thankfully, this psychopath was finally brought to justice. The families of the victims expressed their relief that the murders were finally resolved, even though that was a drop in the ocean compared to the pain they felt at having their loved ones snatched from them. Stephen was finally released in 2009, but he didn't last long on the outside. 6 months later, he walked into a bank in Elmira and robbed it. He was sentenced to prison before being freed again in 2016. When he got out, Stephen Spahalski was interviewed and updated about his brother's shocking crimes. Stephen claimed that he was shocked to hear that his twin was also a murderer. He said, "I thought I was the family's only murderer." Robert is currently incarcerated at Great Meadows Correctional Facility. Only time will tell if his brother Stephen Spahalski will ever live under the same roof as his twin again. Some reports state that the brothers were in a deadly competition with each other about who could commit the most crimes, but there is no way we can know for sure. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of the Spahalski twin brother killers, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.